Visage is a first-person psychological horror game following Dwayne as he explores a large house with a dark past. Atmosphere. The game opens with an incredibly disturbing murder-suicide scene, and then you somehow awaken in the house. It's unclear how you come back, and Vic's Visage feel a little dreamlike, like none of it is really happening and you're trapped in a purgatory. The game splits its parts essentially into 4 chapters with some free roaming in between. The free roaming has no enemies, but feels as though you're being followed by ghosts. Lights turn themselves off and on, and occasionally the sound of footsteps can be heard above and around you. There's an eerie silence, and the light in the hallway swings endlessly like a certain familiar PlayStation 4 game. The design of the house never felt quite similar, and its layout, despite being something you traverse over and over, never managed to stay in my mind. I always felt lost in its basement hallways and side rooms. The free roaming is certainly tense the first time you explore, but after each chapter you return to free roaming and it starts to feel like a pleasant release. The chapters themselves don't have an order, and you can start them whenever you pick up one of their starting items. Lucy's chapter is probably the most intense, with strong feelings of dread and the sensation of toying with things you don't understand. Rakan's chapter was mostly based on paranoia and illness, with a lot of it being set in a hospital. And finally, Dolores' chapter was abstract and surreal, featuring mind-bending corridors and teleporting mirrors. The atmosphere during the main chapters varies wildly, but I found Rakan's chapter was by far the weakest, with the most downtime, and Dolores' chapter taking the longest and being the most bewildering and confusing, with the entire house's layout distorted by the mirrors and featuring foreboding puzzles. The game does have its immersion-breaking moments, with the excessive deaths being one such problem, but also contains a lot of Easter eggs which are incredibly easy to find and, whilst very fun, totally dragged me out of the moment, as well as certain silly moments like the talking kitchen appliances. There's a few parts that just don't work for me, like the shopping centre dream sequence with a shop worker over the tannoy that tells the player that only beer is on sale and they should buy beer, to convey alcoholism of the player character. Despite all this stuff, Visage can be relentlessly tense and atmospheric, with even small cutscenes of mundane tasks feeling intense, but it isn't perfect throughout. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game tries a lot of things and does most of them very well, but starting with the more subtle things, one of my favourite events is presenting something out of the ordinary for the game, like a person standing in a hallway. They often draw no attention to themselves but still seem foreboding. Do you approach them or do you run away? The answer is always approach, but you never really want to do it. There's a lot of subtle moments that mess with the player, like Dolores' shadow appearing behind the tarpaulin in the basement, but when you try and catch a glimpse of what's causing the shadow, it's gone, and the shadow isn't there either. Then there's the disappearing mirrors you have to follow, and the game uses sound design to get you to turn around, and then back again to find it's gone. Pulling the cloth off of them and finding there's nothing underneath is kind of unnerving too. Knocking on the wall in Lucy's room and hearing what is implied to be some otherworldly being knocked back always unsettled me, but the game is filled with things you can tell a mile off are bad news, but you know you have to interact with them anyway. There are an astounding number of scripted events, and some are slow and menacing, like this one of Lucy gifting something to the player. A great mechanic is the camera flash as a light source, which has been done in other games, but Visage uses it very well, with it being one of the only reliable light sources in the game, but also useful for a fraction of a second, revealing things on the wall and making you wait an agonizingly long amount of time to light up the room again to see what lurks in the darkness. There's a fair few jump scares and the build up to them is usually overwhelmingly daunting, like the wardrobe room in Lucy's chapter where you have to guess which wardrobe is the right one because some of them contain enemies, or even something simple like the light going off in the room you're in, which always caused me to panic. The game has random moments where the chapter's antagonist will appear and start chasing you, blinking backwards and forwards, and it can be extremely frightening, but I found most times that it was just very unfair, because once they catch up to you, you die instantly and have to reload the save, which wouldn't be a problem if the antagonist didn't have a habit of appearing directly in front or behind of you, giving you no time to react. This game has by far some of the most unfair deaths, and whilst it states it's hard, this doesn't make up for a frustrating design. Whilst this is very annoying, generally Visage does an incredible job of providing a lot of sometimes terrifying moments. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music in the game is often just an unsettling ambient drone, but it winds up to be more like a swarming amalgamation of horns and high-pitched whines that never fail to make it seem like the world is coming to an end. Each antagonist has their chase music, and while it's usually brief, it's pretty menacing. The music is really powerful stuff, but it's not exactly memorable. It provides the more intense moments with backing, but doesn't turn up other than that. It just provides incidental music for pickup items or paranormal events. The sound effects, on the other hand, built the majority of the atmosphere, from the creaky floorboards to the static on the TV, the PT-inspired swinging hanging lamp, and the raindrops outside. Everything that can make a noise has a sound effect, and it really brings the house to life, even though it's usually empty. There's a lot of creepy noises, but my favourite is the sound of multiple people groaning in disdain when you smash a mirror with a hammer. It's just disturbing.
What took you so long, George? You know when tea time is, and yet you always find a way to be late. Were you in your study room again, scribbling nonsense and talking to your recorder? I'm beginning to think you love your work more than me. I know you'd tire of me. Oh, yes. I know you'd have me gone in a heartbeat if you could.
There's not a lot of voice acting, but the voice used for Dolores is immensely creepy, and the delivery of some of her lines are absolutely fantastic. The directional audio is perfectly functional, and there's not much to say about it. The music and sound effects are pretty damn good, and with the photorealistic graphics, they really help the game become extremely immersive. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There's some unpleasant, gory moments, but not a lot of it is filled with what you'd call blood, with black liquid replacing a lot of it, from Rakan's chapter of pushing eyeballs in until they pop, to Lucy's chapter of handling her lower jaw. The game has its fair share of moments, and none of it feels forced. It all feels quite bizarre too, from climbing down an umbilical cord to the giant eyeball exploding and having to climb into the gaping hole. There's a lot of disturbing and creative moments in the game, and thanks to the surreal nature of some of it, and the graphics, it's constantly walking the line between unsettling because it's realistic, and disturbing because it isn't. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The game opens with the aforementioned murder-suicide with Dwayne and his family, and then he awakens in the house. His neighbour calls and says he hasn't come out of the house for weeks, and he begins to explore. Each chapter deals with a previous person who lived in the house, and the final part being about Dwayne himself. Lucy's chapter is rife with childlike innocence that's tainted by some demonic presence that is communicating with her and asking her to commit terrible acts. It's not hugely original, but the way it's presented is interesting in the game. Rakan's chapter follows his admission into hospital after firing a gun at another demonic being. Upon arriving, he's taken into therapy to recover. Rakan's chapter is by far the least interesting and very abstract in presentation, with a lot of generic televisions and eyeballs making an appearance. Dolores' chapter is about her mental illness and the estraining relationship with her husband George. It's the most interesting chapter because of the strong feeling of decline in her sanity and how menacing she actually seems. Dwayne's chapter is about things that led up to the murder-suicide and the toxic environment in the household. It's difficult to get through because of his overwhelming guilt of past events, and his self-loathing is overly apparent. The story is good in places, but it mostly just hard to swallow traumatic event after traumatic event. A lot of it is implied but never stated, and some of it is difficult to understand. I found I still had an overwhelming number of questions about why some things happened at all after the game was over. Making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Visage can be completely terrifying or totally frustrating. It's got some strange design choices, like it uses inventory management for the few actually useful things you can pick up, but allows you to keep up to 20 key items, which is more than you'll ever have. It can be silly in places. Whilst it's obviously trying to keep things fresh, some of it just doesn't work for me. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, so if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was freaked out by the mirrors, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer. I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.